bank bailout, which are supposed to put money in the hands of spenders and get the economy running again. Of course, neither the bailouts nor the tax cuts did much of anything to prevent or cure the recession. As you can still see, you just have to look around, as I'll get to later. These types of strategies can't do so, because this is more than just a policy problem that's solvable by raising taxes on the rich or increasing government spending. The recession is a result of a generalized crisis in the capitalist economy itself. I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. The income tax portion of the bill is a permanent tax cut aimed at the middle class. The middle class, who are everybody earning under $400,000. However, the next part of the bill is the allowance of the payroll tax holiday to expire. This is something that was just given away. There was no negotiation over that. It was just sort of thrown in there saying, hey, guys, you know, I know you don't like taxes. We don't like this tax either, so we'll not even talk about it. You probably noticed on your last paycheck that you made a little bit less, about $40 off, $40 on average off of your biweekly paycheck. This was another stimulus measure that was enacted in 2010, and it was a reduction of the payroll tax from 6.2% to 4.2%. This bill raised it back, so despite all that rhetoric about making the rich pay their fair share, this tax increase targets everyone who receives a paycheck. The payroll tax is capped at around $106,000 of income, so the brunt of this tax increase is borne mostly by people at the lower end of the income scale. At $106,000, any income beyond that is not taxed at this 6.2%. It just doesn't fall under the payroll tax. So all this stuff about not raising taxes during a recession is still mostly bunk. The biggest beneficiaries of this tax regime, then, everything in this bill, are all those people earning close to the $400,000 bracket. The payroll tax for them is a tiny, tiny fraction, 6% of $100,000. The third important provision of this deal are so-called tax extenders. These are a bundle of various tax credits and subsidies that go almost entirely to corporate recipients. It says there for research development, but it includes things like protection for a type of offshore financing. So it's not really a tax loophole when the government is enforcing it. It's more of a thing that you're actually supposed to do. Tax credits for building entertainment complexes like racetracks and NASCAR tracks. Residential and office real estate surrounding the World Trade Center. Now, if you know that area, this is not for people like you and me. This is actually the primary beneficiary of this policy was Goldman Sachs specifically. It also includes tax credits for things like basic workplace safety, things which a company really should be able to provide on its own if it's a country interested in doing business in this country. I mean, are we really asking workers and taxpayers to pay corporations for not killing us? So while this bill passes what amounts to a massive tax hike on the working class, it works hard to protect the Democrats and the Republicans' primary constituency, the corporations, from, well, having to provide anything. In fact, compared to the $92 billion in revenue gained from the expiration of the payroll tax, $65 billion in free money are being given away to corporate persons simply for being beautiful individual snowflakes. That should be another big red flag regarding about what this whole mess is really about. It's not about the debt. So what can we expect now? These changes still seem relatively minor, and the buddy bonuses to industry seem more like business as usual than anything. The important thing to remember is that this is just the opening act for the next debt showdown at the end of February. What will happen then? Well, the future is entirely uncertain. Just kidding. We can pretty well guess exactly what's going to happen. The changes to the tax code in the Fiscal Cliff bill are permanent, so unless the President and Congress feel like revisiting this issue again, hint, they won't, you can be sure that any more increases in taxes from Bush levels will be off the table. They were already discussed, agreed upon, and set into law via a grand bargain that amounted to a broad tax increase on those least able to fight back through the legislature, i.e. people who are below that $400,000 income bracket. All that remains is the other side of the budget equation, and that is the spending. Both parties have agreed that in this time of great international crisis, we should actually be increasing military spending rather than decreasing. Both Mitt Romney and Barack Obama emphasized this point during their debate on foreign policy. So military spending will be off the table. What does that leave? The only thing left are social programs. First, there is non-defense discretionary spending, which I've said, which is the primary go-to for governments bitten by the budget bug. As I mentioned before, these are all the nice things that we get, the sometimes cool and sometimes necessary things that we get as part of our social contract. Things like education funding, transportation, heating assistance, science. These things have already been cut to the bone, however. Non-defense discretionary budget, non-defense discretionary spending. Sorry, that's a mouthful. You try saying it. These things have already been cut to the bone. I mean, they consist of about 14% of the federal budget. So there's not much left there. After that, the cutting mania will extend to other things that workers depend on heavily in order to survive, both as workers and in old age. Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. The Obama administration has already signaled its willingness to throw in cuts to Medicare by raising the eligibility age, and you can bet that since desperate times call for desperate measures. The other two will be on the table as well. There's been a concerted effort to shift the ideological boundaries of the debate by making it seem like cuts are necessary and the only solution to this manufactured debt problem. Both the Republicans and Democrats agree that we need to raise taxes and cut spending. The only disagreements are over when and how much. We no longer hear about whether we should be cutting these things at all, and after a year of scaremongering over epic fiscal catastrophe, you can be sure that nobody will be talking about preserving the 3 New Deal programs, unless it's us. Speaking of Medicare, by the way, that should be your third red flag. It's true that healthcare costs are one of the biggest drivers of both public and private debt in the United States. PPACA, otherwise known as Obamacare, only makes this problem worse by mandating the purchase of health insurance without also mandating a price cap on premiums. While there is a subsidy for those who can't afford it, you'll see these subsidies eat up a larger and larger share of government spending, as insurance companies have no incentive to not increase their prices. The United States pays the most and gets some of the worst outcomes for its health systems in the developed world. The solution for this is simple: a nationalized health service where healthcare is provided for people and not for profit would all at once take a huge chunk out of the federal deficit, massively improve the lives of people who can barely afford healthcare, i.e. almost everyone, and improve health outcomes for all of the country's people. Of course, it's not about the deficit. It never was. It's about keeping a chain around the neck of working people. Of course you'll take a pay cut because you have health benefits, and if you quit, who's going to pay for your kids' medical bills if they get sick? Of course you'll work the graveyard shift and not talk to that weird union guy, because in 5 years you might get that sweet salary position with benefits. Yeah. So that's what you should be watching for during the new debt ceiling drama. We have to make some tough decisions, and those tough decisions will be higher taxes, fewer services, longer hours, fewer jobs. And the deficit will go right on growing afterwards, because it was never about the deficit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Europe now. I'll digress a little bit, but it's really the same. This situation is really about austerity. That is, robbing the working class to maintain the profits of the owning class. And it's part of a trend that's happening both here in Europe with the same underlying cause. I mean, you just look to Greece, Spain, Italy, and Ireland, and you will see the future of austerity that will happen here. And the same things are being repeated already over there. So I'll talk a little bit about the situation. In November, the Greek Parliament approved the latest round of austerity measures imposed by the European Central Bank. It did a whole bunch of things, raising the retirement age from 65 to 67, cutting pensions by 15%, massive pay cuts in the public sector, changes in labor laws to make it easier to fire workers and limit the compensation of senior workers. It includes the expansion of previous austerity policies, namely broad tax increases and the privatization of public lands into the hands of wealthy German and French financiers. So this austerity madness, like our austerity madness, began with the recession of 2008, in which the relatively indebted countries of Southern Europe, with economies based primarily on tourism and services, experienced a severe and pervasive debt crisis. As a result of the recession, interest rates on the bonds that these countries used to finance their government spending and social programs rose sharply, threatening those countries with default if something was not done. And done something was. The European Central Bank, along with the European Commission and the International Monetary Fund, affectionately known as the Troika, fearing the disastrous consequences of a Greek default, moved quickly to provide a series of emergency loans to distressed European countries. This was basically a signal to banks and large financiers that the world order is not going to let them, take the hit. This is the same signal that was sent to the banks in the United States during the recession with the toxic assets. They're not going to let them take the hit. We're quibbling over $1.2 trillion in budget cuts and tax increases when we handed out $13 trillion to banks in 2008. Well, much like the mob, it's generally not a good idea to cut a deal with the IMF. You always end up getting screwed somehow. In this case, they made the Greek ruling class an offer they couldn't refuse. What did the Troika get in return? As I mentioned earlier, huge packages of cuts to social services, including education, pensions, welfare, increases in taxes, and the auctioning off to the highest bidder of natural resources and the economic futures of the Greek people. Is this starting to sound familiar? The raising of taxes and the slashing of social spending, by the way, is referred to as fiscal consolidation in econ speak. The idea, or the way it's been pushed by the IMF, is that the imposition of austerity measures will calm the bond markets, the wealthy and easily spooked investors in government bonds. Mainly wealthy European and American banks will see that a particular country is serious about paying its debts, and as a result will allow loans to flow freely, thereby spurring investment, consumption, and growth. The invisible hand of the free market to the rescue once again. Well, we can talk about, we see the future here in Greece. So, I mean, what's the result of fiscal consolidation on the ordinary working people in Greece? Surprisingly enough, raising taxes on the poor and destroying their access to education, housing, jobs, and all manner of public services that make a civilized society worth living in did not actually solve any of the problems it stated it would. In fact, it's made many of them worse. The Greek economy has remained in recession for the past 5 straight years. The national output has declined by 20%. The average wage rate has fallen by 35%, and unemployment has ballooned to 25%. More alarmingly, the suicide in Greece has skyrocketed, increasing by 37% from 2009 to 2011. In fact, it's so bad that the IMF economists themselves have come out of the woodwork, Alan Greenspan style, and published a paper saying that the outcomes they projected for austerity policies, quote, triggered much larger contractions than the original program had assumed, unquote. And Greece now urgently needs a greater emphasis on growth and less emphasis on austerity. Unfortunately, these are just the personal positions of IMF economists, and for some reason, IMF doesn't put its economists in charge of policy. That should be another clue, that this is not about debt or economics or anything like that. So, what you hear in the media about what's going on in Greece is that they dug their own hole by expecting goods and services and not working. Now, aside from the fact that they have the longest work week in Europe, is an important point because in becoming the common wisdom, it obscures the true nature of the crisis in Europe as which is actually a symptom of the general crisis in the world capitalist economy. Just as the political theater in the USA over the debt ceiling and deficits have done the same thing. What really happened in Europe is that the Eurozone basically became a scheme by which highly industrialized nations obtained both a market and a production base for their own manufactured goods at the expense of the industrial production of lesser developed countries. In typical international markets, the way that less developed countries compete with highly developed countries is by keeping the value of their currencies low with respect to those of developed ones. For example, if the US makes cars and China makes cars, we can assume that there isn't much difference in the raw materials and expertise required to manufacture them. Contrary to what you might think, Chinese cars are actually pretty high quality these days. However, if, for example, the Chinese yuan drops to half the value of the US dollar, then I, as a world consumer, can buy a car, as well as any other Chinese good, for half the price I used to be able to. In addition, it's now much more attractive for me to take my foreign capital and contract my own manufacturing to a Chinese manufacturer instead of my home country, since I can pay relatively less. Of course, for Chinese consumers, anything produced by the US would suddenly be twice as expensive. So Chinese manufacturing basically benefits at the expense of the purchasing power of consumers. Demand for Chinese cars would soar. In fact, this is a point of contention between the US and China in real life, with the US maintaining that China keeps its exchange rate artificially low preventing any American companies from accessing that sweet, sweet 1.3 billion strong market. So in Europe, we have a highly developed financial and productive center, based mainly around the economies of France and Germany. Meanwhile, as other countries are added to the Eurozone, the use of a common currency means that those countries with weaker manufacturing sectors cannot devalue in order to boost their output, meaning they can't compete with established manufacturers. So France and Germany, in the final analysis, had a captive market in the European periphery. They could sell their goods and have their products bought by people who were using the euro. They couldn't, their own internal industries couldn't develop. Then they could loan money to these governments who would then, pay workers and develop their countries. And then they would pay a healthy rate of interest back to the French and German banks. Now this is all well and good in the cycle of debt and circulating around, causing development and production. The music suddenly stopped. All of a sudden, many trillions of dollars worth of value seemed to disappear overnight. This was in 2008. What debt really is a claim on future revenue or future production. When things are humming along nicely and financial investors expect that the debt will be paid back, plus interest, of course, then the system functions. When it turns out, however, that there's no way that the value of what is being produced can match up with the value of the debt, panic results. Investors start demanding higher and higher interest rates, the credit markets freeze up, and there is much wailing and gnashing of teeth. We have what we call a debt crisis, which is exactly what happened in 1997 Asian financial crisis as well. There were huge inflows of foreign investment into Southeast Asian economies, which were developing rapidly. All of a sudden, they found themselves in a situation where profit rates on those investments were not enough to cover the interest payments on the debt, and a debt crisis was the result. So I was talking about the US situation and also the European situation. I kept saying before that the problem is never really about the debt itself. In the case of the Asian financial crisis, it was a symptom of an underlying problem. In the United States, the debt is acting as a political cover for a brutal solution. I say that because right now, as was the case during the debt ceiling battle in 2011, and will be the case in February, there's no chance that the United States will default on its debt. Confidence in US debt is based on the expectation that it will be able to pay, which is guaranteed almost by default by the dominance of the US military machine and the US financial system. I know that, and people holding US debt know that. And if there was any real danger of the US defaulting, then you would see interest rates rise in much the same way that they did for Greek and Spanish bonds. They did not, and have in fact, the interest rates on Treasury bonds have not risen beyond 3%, signaling that the US debt is an extremely safe investment, in fact, the safest in the world. The core problem in all these crises lies within the heart of the way production is organized globally. In fact, the nature of capitalist production itself requires that the owners of capitalist enterprises maximize profit at all costs, both human and monetary. It's enshrined in our legal system too. If a CEO fails to maximize profits for his or her shareholders, then those shareholders have legal standing to sue. More than that, as technology advances and we can produce more and more things with less and less work, the value of the things that we produce falls. You can see this in action with the technology industry. Computers, when they were first arrived on the scene, they were extremely expensive, extremely large, extremely noisy. Only universities and the government could afford them. Over the years, we had better productivity, better technology, better manufacturing techniques. And so the value of these computers, even as they became more useful and more pervasive, the value of them dropped. So now we see them everywhere. It used to be in the 80s, you saw computers like, man, that's cool, I wish I had one. What's this email? But now, it's ubiquitous. You look at somebody who doesn't have a smartphone, it's like, that's a weirdo. The result is a less profit per commodity, but less profit per unit of output, but a greater penetration, a greater expansion of physical production. Now, if you're a capitalist, you're sort of stuck here. You have no choice. You have to produce more, despite it making the value of your product drop. Because if you don't, somebody else will produce at a lower cost and undercut you. So you increase your productivity or be driven out of the market. Your physical production expands, but value falls with each unit of output that you create. Eventually, you'll get to a point where there'll be insufficient product for you to sell your product. insufficient profit for you to sell your product. You get to a point where it's just you can't sell enough to make up the amount that you put in. This is a crisis of overproduction. You have too much capital. Your factories are lying idle. You have unsold products. You have to lay off workers. Your productive capacity has to be destroyed, either by devaluing your own investment goods, your capital, your factories, your machinery, or by physical destruction, which is what we saw in World War II. If you've taken out loans to invest in your production and you suddenly finding that you're not making as much product as you used to, you have a debt crisis as a result. These are basically absurd situations where people want to produce and want to consume, but because productivity is not profitable enough for people to invest, it doesn't happen. I mean, this is why you get companies sitting on trillions of dollars in bailout money. I mean, this is actually why Keynesian type solutions, taxing the rich and deficit spending, stimulus spending during crises, is not the solution to this problem. It works within the capitalist system to sort of kickstart the economy by giving more money to people who can spend and invest. The problem is there's nothing to invest in. In order for that to work, the expected growth rate has to be greater than the interest payments that you're making for the debt that you use to deficit spend. If there's a problem within the system of production itself, which is what happens with this tendency of the profit rate to fall, then that won't work, because your rate of profit will never be greater than the rate of interest that financiers will demand. That's where austerity comes in. Ronald Reagan in the 70s, he blamed the recessions on big labor. They were demanding too much. They were asking, things like a living wage and health benefits and, education. And that was eating into corporate profits. They were taking too much of the surplus that was being produced and siphoned off to the people at the top. He was essentially right. This system of organizing production is not compatible with a society that needs to provide for all of its workers, for everybody who's actually producing rather than parasitizing. It can't provide a living wage for everybody. It can't provide health for everybody. It can't provide the services that everybody needs. But when crises of production, when crises of profitability happen like this, this is the final place that the ruling class needs to go. That's what's a beleaguered ruling class supposed to do in a crisis of declining profitability? Well, they're going to go to the workers and say, hey, maybe you should take a little bit less in wages so I can add that to my bottom line. And that's really the root of austerity, both here and Europe. That's why you see the obsession with tax cuts spending cuts and tax increases. It's an assault on workers, basically, to reduce the standard of living goes down, then you have to pay your worker. You don't have to pay your workers as much. I mean, if you directly decrease the wage rate, you directly decrease the health benefits that you're supposed to provide. That's a little bit of a cushion against this declining rate of profit. If you have greater unemployment, then everybody has to compete more and more for jobs. They'll take lesser and lesser wages. People will take the worst job they could, or terrible jobs that they wouldn't have taken otherwise, because there's just no other alternatives on the market. So this is the austerity solution, and it won't stop. It won't stop unless we stop it, because the way production is organized will always tend to decline in profitability. It's a problem within the system itself. It can't be solved from Keynesian solutions, taxing the rich. Even if you do tax the rich and you redistribute to the poor, eventually revenues are going to go down. You'll have nothing left to tax. The only solution is to overturn the system of production for profit and institute a system which provides for the people who actually produce. Thank you.